This is chapter 2, the neurobiology of stress. Now this chapter is about using knowledge for the purposes of freedom, the purposes of emancipation. And when we use knowledge as a learning curve and give ourselves space to get it wrong, that's okay. It becomes liberating. Now, human beings, that's you, that's me, we can learn powerfully. Now, often we learn at school that we cannot learn. Schools, sadly, often teach us to fail and to feel like failures. We are not. We just didn't have good models showing us how to learn well. Now, human beings learn best when we no longer blame ourselves, shame ourselves, blame others for our responses, but manage to remain in a learning frame. So what is a learning frame? It's a really good question. Well, it's a mental and emotional state of observation, curiosity, and choice. Observation, curiosity, and choice. Now, observation simply means we can see clearly the nature of phenomena, stuff that's happening both internally and externally, whether that's thoughts, feelings, body sensations, objects, people, our environment, and how these different phenomena interact and interrelate. Observation is seeing all of this clearly. It's paying attention. Curiosity is a playful inquiry. It's looking at, if that does that, then this does that, then what does that do? It's about how things connect and relate. Curiosity is important. And choice is the capacity to make an informed choice based on all the information, all the data we have available from our sense fields, from our memory, from our emotions, from our body, from our thoughts, from our motivations, from our beliefs and intentions. All of this is staying in choice. So staying in a learning frame, given things as they are now, what can I do from here? Given things as they are now, what can I do from here? What choices do I have? Where is the leverage? This is staying in a learning frame. Now we've looked at the biology of stress a little bit. First comes a phenomena acting as stressor. This triggers a perception of, yes, I can handle this, or I'm in over my head. And this kind of perception happens subcortically, meaning you don't have time to think about it. It just happens before you have time to think about it. And instantly, the key brain areas of the limbic system, the amygdala and the hypothalamus lower in the brain, and the pituitary, and we talked about those, and the glands and the hormones they release, they take over and create the stress cascade in a subcortical reflex, just like that. Boom, we're in it. This all happens super fast because it's survival mechanisms. All we know is we're in it up to our necks. Stressors are simply stimuli. They can be internal, such as thoughts and feelings or sensations, or even patterns of breath. Stressors are stimuli that trigger us into a stress cascade. Like I said, they can be external, such as events, people and their behaviors. It can be our behaviors. It can be our behavioral responses. We can get stressed about how we behave. It can be emails. It could be social media. It could be money. It can be anything. Stressors are what they are for us. What are they for you? What are your stressors? It's your job to gradually identify them and dismantle their power over your life. This happens first of all through awareness of these patterns. We have to be aware of the patterns. Now, like I said, the stress cascade consists of stimulus, perception, neuroendocrine activation, physiology, and behavior. Now that's worth saying again. It's stimulus, which acts as a trigger to our perception, followed by the neuroendocrine activation, the physiological aspects of stress, such as hormones, patterns of blood flow. The blood flow changes under the stress hormones, and also our behavioral response. It's all those pieces together. Now, this stress cascade is potentially an endless loop, as behaviour can be a stimulus that leads to other social and environmental stressors. If we behave in a way that complicates our life, that's problematic. Those are then further stressors. Remember, a stimulus that acts as a stressor is an internal or external phenomena. The stimulus leads to an immediate, within milliseconds, perception of threat that probably isn't mediated cognitively through your thought patterns, through choice. It may be. It's usually an immediate trigger. Sometimes, if it is mediated cognitively, then those cognitions, those thoughts themselves can act as triggers. We can think difficult things. We can think ourselves into problems. Now, perception is often subconscious. And like I said, it's such a rapid assessment of a situation as threatening. And this kind of rapid assessment, this situation, challenges perception of the actual level of resources, leading to feeling overwhelmed and unable to cope. We know that 76% of the UK population are in a state of overwhelm post-COVID. And these unable to cope feelings and associated thoughts, like I said, are rapid-fire millisecond assessments of the situation that lead to the stress cascade. Stress cascade is perception, stimuli, perception, physiological response, followed by behaviour. Now, physiology is what happens in the glandular expression of this threat. It's the release of the stress mediators, the stress hormones. And those get the body ready for fight or flight. There's epinephrine or adrenaline, and there are glucocorticoids, cortisol, which is the long-term stress mediator. And these lead to the classic patterns of the overwhelmed sympathetic nervous system, which is the fight or flight nervous system, which includes fight, flight, freeze, flop, and fawn, which is where you make friends with people who are aggressors. These neuroendocrine responses include the shunting of blood to muscles and the brain away from the gut, which is why we shouldn't eat when we're stressed, as well as increased heart rate, increased breath rate and depth. And often stress response causes the butterfly feelings in the gut that people experience as anxiety, fear. Now, interestingly, excitement has very similar neurobiology, right? But a different outcome. Anxiety and excitement are both concerns about the future. Physiology also includes the effects of these hormones on brain function. And stress effects on brain function include reduced learning capacity. We can't learn as well when we're stressed. Reduced memory. We can't remember. We can't remember what has happened. We can't remember what's happening now. Poorer decision making. Irritability. Less empathy. We can't feel other people. Stress effects on physiology also lead to a rise in cardiometabolic disorders, like we said, and mental health issues as well. Poor mood and problematic sleep. Problematic sleep is problematic because it depletes our resources even further, creating more stress cascades. So if we have a stress dynamic going on that's stopping us sleep, we have to sort it out. Now, as you can see, the pattern has to be interrupted before it goes into a downward spiral. Behaviour is what we do to ourselves and act into the world when we're experiencing this stress cascade. And its physiological consequences. Now, this behaviour in the world includes withdrawal from relationships. Some people withdraw from relationships. Some people get aggressive and push for what they want. It creates poor choice making. It creates angry and violent behaviour, depression, anxiety, and a lack of self-care and a lack of care for others. Also a rise in neglect and a rise in abuse within relationships for children, for people we perhaps should love and care for. Let's look at the hypothalamus and pituitary a little bit. So what exactly does the hypothalamus do, and what does it have to do with the stress experience? Now, we've talked about it a little bit. But the hypothalamus is a fascinating area. It's the union between the endocrine system, that's the glands that release hormones into the blood, and affect metabolism, mood, and the functionality of the body and the whole system, in fact. The nervous system, everything. It's the junction between that and the brain. And it's the junction that unifies both aspects of communication, neural communication as thought and feeling, and body communication. So it's a unified neuroendocrine system. It sits behind your eyes in the middle of the brain, just to the medial border of the upper brainstem, right next to the pituitary gland, which it is very, very closely associated with. Now, the hypothalamus essentially coordinates and controls the whole autonomic nervous system, which is everything that happens in your body which you don't think about, and the whole of the endocrine system, which is all the glandular system of the body. The hypothalamus is such a huge job for such a small little area. Now, the autonomic nervous system is all the involuntary and mostly out of consciousness functions of the body. It's digestion, it's blood flow, it's temperature, it's everything you don't think about. And that's all controlled by the hypothalamus and the brainstem as well. Now, the hypothalamus receives input from the limbic system, which is the emotional brain, including the amygdala. And the amygdala is like the trauma watchdog. The trauma watchdog barks as soon as anything resembles any trauma we've ever had. The hypothalamus is also linked to the thinking brain, the cerebral cortex, and the movement-making brain, the motor cortex, and the thalamus, which is like a relay station between the body and all of the sense fields except smell. So we've got all these areas linked into the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus is also connected to the areas involved with learning and episodic memory. The hypothalamus is also a gland releasing key controller hormones. These controller hormones inform the pituitary gland to release other hormones. It releases 7 more hormones, basically. And these are key hormones for the whole body. So the hypothalamus and pituitary act as a team, closely connected in brain geography. They're right next to each other, closely connected by a kind of neural stalk, which is a bit neural tube between them called the if I can say it, infundibulum, and closely connected by special arteries and veins that carry products from the hypothalamus, stimulating and inhibiting hormones from the pituitary gland. Now, given the hypothalamus is the gateway between the systems, connected to the limbic system, the emotional brain, the thinking brain, the cortex, and the hypothalamic pituitary team that releases the hormones that control everything in the body, metabolism, blood-water balance, salt balance, everything. And it also initiates glucocorticoid hormones to be released from the adrenal cortex when we're in long-term stress. These glands are implicit and at the very, very heart of the stress cascade. Now, down above your kidneys, which are just below the lower ribs, we have the adrenal glands, which release adrenaline and cortisol. Adrenaline is the hormone from the medulla of the adrenal glands, and it creates the initial hormonal surge of the sympathetic nervous system response. So right now you'll have felt it in your system. That's adrenaline. That's fright, fight, or flight. And this response it also includes, like I said, freeze, like a frozen rabbit, fawn, which is where we make friends with people, and also flop, collapse. Now, adrenaline is released after the hypothalamus is triggered by the amygdala in the limbic system. So it's perception, limbic system, subcortical activity, all of it. The adrenaline is triggered, milliseconds that stuff's out. The hypothalamus sends a signal to the adrenal medulla, which reduces the adrenaline, which is what happens. And you felt how fast that was. When I made that noise, it was instantaneous. Adrenaline, by the way, is also known as epinephrine and norepinephrine in the US. Adrenaline increases heart rate, respiratory rate, and blood pressure, whilst expanding the passages in the lungs. Adrenaline also shunts blood, like I said, from digestion to the brain and the muscles, which is why we shouldn't eat when we're busy or stressed. We should wait to eat when we're relaxed and blood can go to the guts. Adrenaline prepares your body to run, to fight, or respond to the threatening context in a survival-oriented mode. Adrenaline's amazing. It works really well. We just don't want it all the time. Now, adrenaline can remain in the system for up to 6 hours. Repeated doses of adrenaline from an active and overwhelmed lifestyle lead to stress cascades that often remain unresolved. We have lots of adrenaline floating around. Thus, the respiratory rate can be functioning at a distressed level. We could be breathing too fast. That pushes carbon dioxide out of the blood. That reduces the capacity for oxygen to get into the brain, and we get more stressed. So unless the adrenaline is resolved through daily movement, that's cardiovascular exercise and movement practices, best if they've got breath intelligence as an aspect of them, or breath movement practices with slow and deep regulated breath, things like yoga or Pilates, then the stress-based normalization of respiration, that's breathing, begins to occur. Our breathing changes under the influence of longer-term stress. Cortisol is the hormonal mediator of longer-term stress. Amongst many other effects on body and mind, it leads to suboptimal breathing. Like I said, this slightly fast respiratory rate, it's over-breathing, as the Potato School and the Oxygen Advantage calls it. Over-breathing means breathing that is ventilating gases, air, in and out of the body more than your metabolic demand. That is more than how much energy you actually need for your body, because oxygen is used in the body to enable the cellular energy production processes to occur effectively. So we're pumping gas in and out more than we actually need. And that, like I said, then reduces carbon dioxide. Cortisol initially offers resistance to stress, and it does this by increasing glucose availability to the cells. It's ready to provide more energy to deal with the stressor. It also increases the sensitivity of the blood vessels so they can be constricted more easily. And of course, the long-term outcome of that is increased blood pressure, which then, causes more problems if it's sustained more than that period of time where there's an emergency. It's great if you're losing blood, but not if you're just dealing with a complex work agenda. Increased blood pressure is not helpful. Now, cortisol also reduces inflammation by inhibiting the cells that participate in inflammatory responses. A side effect of this is slower wound healing. Now, the longer-term consequences of continued cortisol release from long-term stress patterns include disruption to many body processes and then ultimately an increase in inflammation. That's what happens, and that's due to the release of cytokines into the system, which are a kind of communication within the system, which is unmodulated by cortisol. That itself then causes all sorts of problems. Cortisol can also increase the likelihood of fatigue, headaches, reduced immune function, increases in irritability, depression, anxiety, weight gain, low libido, erectile dysfunction, menstrual problems, body pain. The list is long. And also increased risk of cardiometabolic disorders. That's heart attacks, strokes, cancers, this kind of problem in the system. So we have to deal with stress and turn it into resilience. Stress, particularly long-term and repeated stress, is debilitating, destroying the quality of life. It is a killer. Now, bipedalism, that's standing on 2 feet and walking around, and our ventral surface, this is our ventral surface, this is vulnerable. Standing on 2 feet has many profound systems-wide consequences. Pre-hominid mammals, that's before creatures started walking on 2 legs, they have their soft belly facing the ground, and that's safe. They're armored, protected on the back, they have teeth, they have claws, this kind of thing. But the bipedal mammals, the ones that walk around on 2 feet, they have their vulnerable belly facing the world, their face facing the world. So we're going to have a look at some of the consequences of this, and some are more useful to see through the lens of anatomy and some through physiology. They're all connected. They're different lenses onto the same experience of being human. Now let's look at some of these anatomical changes and some of the sociological and psychological consequences. Lots of logicals in here. Logic means that's a study of these things. Now, when we stand upright on our feet, our vulnerable ventral surface, like I said, faces forwards. Every previous creature that evolved, it faced the ground and was relatively protected. In us humans, unless we wear armor or we armor up our body, it isn't protected at all. There are no bones between the pubic bone and the sternum, just a vulnerable, breathing belly. Our face also points in the same direction. Different again for quadrupeds, whose faces, if you turned them around and put their belly up, would point upwards in the field of gravity. Yeah. So it's a different experience. Now, our skulls do not have room for big muscles to power big jaws with big teeth. You have a choice. The space is needed for a larger brain. You have a choice between having a big jaw and big muscles to power it, or a brain to enable social communication. We have a brain for social communication. Our front paws are off the floor. Our cranium, anus, and genitals are now on different levels for the first time in evolutionary history. And our genitals face forwards, rather than being tucked between the back legs. This visible situation, this visible, vulnerable situation, and a communicating, thinking brain, right? We get all sorts of things happening, from visual comparison, right? All the associated narratives of what it is to be human, a whole range of meanings. We develop clothing, a whole fashion industry, and body type judgments, yeah? And body shame. All of this is out of the gate and into the track of history. All of this is out of the starting gate and into the track of history. Our ventral surface facing forwards means we have to communicate differently, along with greater levels of communication, verbal communication, along with the potential for face-to-face meeting, which is uniquely human. We get the shadow side of armor, like I said, to protect this vulnerability, both in warfare and muscular armor in social dynamics, where we tighten and squeeze muscles to seek to protect ourselves. Paws off the floor gives us the possibility of opposable fingers and thumbs, which enable tool making. Everything from stone axes to computers. Our post-arboreal upright stance, what does that mean? It means we've come out of trees. We're walking on 2 feet. Also gave us shoulders that could throw overarm. And this change enabled human beings to throw projectiles to a considerable distance, whether it's stones or spears. We were the first creature, other than venom-spitting snakes, that could kill at a distance. Along with our tool-making hands, we invented spears, bows, and arrows. And this trajectory of killing, the capacity to kill at a distance, eventually and inexorably led to gunpowder, then machine guns, and eventually nuclear missiles. And now we have even more stress. Cranium, anus, and genitals, all on the same levels in a quadruped, is leveling, literally. When the cranium is lifted above the anus, which it is in a human being, we get supremacy of the cranium and thinking over the body functions. And hey presto, we're on track to a whole range, a whole range of supremacist, polarity-oriented views, beliefs, narratives, stories, and behaviors about this being better than that in these kind of ascendancy-oriented narratives. Violence, comparison, shame, and the experience of being a separate life form, which we find through injury, death, and disease, and the need for our relatively puny species to band together. We have neither big teeth, nor fangs, nor fur to keep warm. It leads to a whole new variety of social stress and culture construction. Powerful. Take a breath. This is just a fraction of the story of our evolutionary arising and its consequences. But stress has always been a part of this. Environmental stress, stress from predation, stress from injury, stress from disease and death, developmental stress, social stress on top of this. And finally, We bring into in the last 10,000 years stress from poverty, overwork, email overwhelm, and all the modern causes of stress that lead to the cardiometabolic disorders that are, in fact, the key killers of the modern age. Tigers are largely gone. Nowadays, it's other things that kill us. The key here is that all behaviour is learned. All behaviour is conditioned by family, culture, schools. What did we learn? What did you learn about who you are, about how to be in the world, and how to behave from all those different sources that affected you and influenced you? How much of that is currently appropriate or useful? How rapidly can you delete that which isn't useful? Unconscious replication of our conditioning, the influences and how they affected us into the world, assumes two things. Number one is that we are our conditioning. We aren't, it's an installation. And number two, that living as conditioning is the right and only way to be. It isn't. You do have choice. Even if you don't know it, you do have choice. For the next bit on this neurobiology of stress, I want to talk about the vagus nerve. And vagus comes from the same Latin root as vagabond and vagrant, and it means to wander. The vagus nerve is the longest nerve in the body. It looks like it meanders, which is a result actually of its evolutionary journey and how nerves in mammalian bodies arrive from the same segments they originally developed from in the bodies of, for example, fish. And they're repurposed. Fish don't breathe in air, they breathe water, and yet we utilize many of the structures from the fish-style body. Now the vagus nerve feeds down into the chest from the brainstem, and it connects to the lungs and heart, and it feeds down into the guts and connects into the intestines and the organs in the belly. The vagus nerve is a cranial nerve, and that means it comes directly from and to the brain and doesn't pass through the spinal cord. Now, there are 12 cranial nerves in total for a human being, and the vagus we count as number 10. The other nerves innervate the muscles of the face, the eyes, the ears, the throat, and number 11 is important because it innervates the upper trapezius, this muscle here. It's quite an important muscle in social stress. And this innervation here is connected to breastfeeding when we were babies. We had to be able to move our heads, so we have that innately built in. Now, the vagus nerve is the neurological facet of the combined neuroendocrine response that takes the body into relaxation. Now, this is the parasympathetic nervous system, or the relaxation response. So this is in contrast to the spinal aspect of the neuroendocrine response that takes us into alert and action, the sympathetic nervous system, and also then into the fight and flight response. So we have the sympathetic nervous system response and the parasympathetic nervous system response, which is taking us into relaxation. The vagus nerve is key for taking us into relaxation. Now, the vagus nerve and its characteristics, as well as the relationship between sympathetic and parasympathetic and the neuroendocrine responses, are important for us to understand. If we understand them, we can work with them. The vagus nerve is highly important in our work. It is the key nerve that innervates and regulates the organs of the chest and the belly in terms of taking them into relaxation. It's key nerve in terms of down-regulating the respiratory rate, the heart rate, and digestion, which becomes slower and more relaxed under its activity. There are ways of activating the vagus nerve to increase what is called vagal tone. And these methods include slow, deep, abdominal, diaphragmatic breathing, breathing into the belly. They include humming. And these different ways of creating vagal tone in the system through sound and through breathing are key ways that we can work within breathwork to bring our system down out of stress into a place of calm. We are also segmented, believe it or not, just like a worm is. We just don't look like it. And our segmented structure is arranged around what are called somites. And each somite has a ring of bone and a pair of nerves emerging from the spinal cord. So in a vertebrate like us, a segment is a ring of bone and a pair of nerves. It is in essence a segment. Like I said, we just don't look like it. Now in a human embryo, there are 42 to 44 somites. And in a child and an adult, there are 35 to 37, as several pairs merge together into what would have been our tail, but is now the coccyx and so forth. Now the pair of nerves coming out of each of these segments are composed of an incoming, that's afferent, and outgoing, efferent parts. And they receive sensory information in the body, and they give motor control to the structures of the body. So they have nerves coming in and nerves coming out of the spinal cord. Sensory information coming in, motor control coming out. Now, when we develop a motor skill, such as riding a bicycle or walking or refined breath work, we need to develop the sensory map first so that we can then utilize the motor function. This is really important in terms of advanced breath work. We need to feel before we can do it. Doing is made up of feeling and failing, feeling and failing, feeling and failing before we master the skill. This is another way of saying learning and practice, 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 or another word for it, discipline. Discipline is a necessary neurological element of refined motor skills and of changing old patterns. It is a key element of emancipating yourself from stress and building resilience. Now the autonomic nervous system, autonomic means it runs itself. It runs everything we don't think of, everything we don't pay attention to, or anything we can't do anything about. Things like digestion, things like blood acidity and alkalinity. Well, the autonomic is in charge of its own function, and we have no real voluntary access to it. Now, largely that is true, but we do have access. Some. Okay? Now, the autonomic nervous system works in total conjunction with the endocrine system, like we looked at, linked by the hypothalamus, which we've talked about. It is the neuroendocrine system. I'm just recapping here because I think it's important information. Of course, we know now that autonomic is not a totally accurate name. There's modern research on meditation, breathwork, and something called psychoneuroimmunology, which is how the mind affects our immune systems, is showing that some degree of control is possible. So degree of control is possible over some aspects of these autonomic functions. You know, Wim Hof and research on Wim Hof's breathing has shown this as well. How much is yet to be defined. Now, Stephen Porges came up with something called the polyvagal theory in 1994. And why do you need to know about it? Well, I'll tell you a little bit. And there are questions as to its evidence base. It's still unclear. And in social neuroscience, this polyvagal theory is not yet accepted. However, it does have some really good explanatory model. It's a really good explanatory model to understand a bit of how we work. So we're going to explore it a little bit. Now, polyvagal theory says there are two routes to the mammalian vagus nerve, that long wandering nerve I talked about. And we're going to explore what those mean and how they work, because it is really good for understanding stress and trauma and how to work with a range of challenges in the human experience. So Stephen Porges identified what he suggests is a double route of the vagus nerve. Now, arising from both the dorsal and the ventral surfaces of the medulla in the brainstem. This basically means there are two vagal nerves, hence polyvagal. Now, how do these work? Now, in this theory, each of these two nerves has a slightly different function and a slightly different area of operation. but it's an important difference. Now, Paul just named the two nerves, the vagus nerves, the dorsal vagal and the ventral vagal, depending on which part of the medulla they come out of. So we'll use those terms. Both dorsal vagal and ventral vagal are, like I said, aspects of our overall autonomic nervous system. We're going into relaxation mode. Paul just suggests that these two vagal nerves, dorsal and ventral, differentially affect our state of alertness, our state of relaxation, our state of presence, and our state of emotional tone. The vagal nerves are cranial nerves. They arise from brainstem, and like the other cranial nerves, they are also involved in how we relate to each other through the social engagement system. Social engagement systems of nerves, facial muscles, sensory systems, and behavior. When we're talking to each other, we're constantly measuring. It's like these 12 nerves are acting in relationship to each other. And they can lead us to being bright, present, and socially engaged, or quiet, present, engaged, and intimate, and also potentially to debilitating problems, including depression, withdrawal, extreme body pain, chronic fatigue, and a host of other complex difficulties. The vagus nerve is affected by how we breathe, and breathing practices are said to be able to create a vagal tone that can lead to a greater state of well-being. We need to understand enough about these nerves and the polyvagal model so we can understand how we can best use our breath practices, best use all our practices to affect the vagal nerve well and in turn affect our well-being. So let's go a bit deeper. The dorsal vagal is at its best rest and digest. So you curl up after a big meal and let the blood flow to your intestines and away from the muscles, away from the brain. You relax and you digest the food. Now, the dorsal vagal at its most extreme activation is freeze, flop, faint, and fall into body pain. It's a complete collapse. Now, it's been suggested that some conditions, such as fibromyalgia and related conditions, may have a very high vagal component. There may also be a component of how breathing affects blood gases. Like I said, oxygen uptake in the cells from the hemoglobin in the blood, which is the pigment that carries the oxygen from the lungs through to the blood. If there's a reduction of carbon dioxide, that reduces the amount of oxygen going to the cells. And then we have less ATP energy and the cells can't repair themselves as well. So that reduction of carbon dioxide in the blood reduces the oxygen getting into the cells, and that reduces ATP and cellular repair. Okay, and that's all from breathing dysfunctionally. The dorsal vagal is also related to learned helplessness. The dorsal vagal nerve runs mostly to the guts, mostly to the abdomen, with just some fibers in the chest and the thorax. Now the ventral vagal, its function at its best is social engagement. It's relaxed presence with others where we engage in conversation, in banter, in dialogue, in discussion, in debate, in argument. We exchange meanings and sense-making. Maybe over dinner, perhaps resting under trees, hanging out, perhaps at work, or travelling on the bus. It doesn't matter. It's about us engaging with people. Wherever and however our cranial nerves are engaged, listening to each other, these two systems tuning in tone, in tuning into the words, watching the micromuscular movements of each of our friends' faces and engaging our theory of mind and mirror neurons. I'll explain a little bit about theory of mind. Theory of mind is the way we consider what others may be thinking, what they may be feeling, or what they may be experiencing. Both theory of mind and mirror neurons are connected to empathy and to social and physical learning. What does this person mean? How do we know this? How does this change or add to what I know? Who am I in relationship to this? And who are you in this dialogue? What is my place? What is your place? What is our relationship about? Theory of mind is about all of this. Now, the ventral vagus nerve runs mostly to the throat, the lungs, the heart, and the tongue, with only some fibers to the guts. Now, coming back from this into the sympathetic nervous system, this is part of the puzzle as well. The sympathetic nervous system, we've talked about this already, as the fight, flight, fawn and flop system of what's called the stress response. And this response, as we've looked at, is automatically activated when we feel threatened. It's super rapid, it's powerful, it's a survival response that sends blood to muscles and the brain, and it is first a neural and then a super rapid hormonal response. We've talked about this already with the stress cascade. This hormonal response, like we said, is initially driven by adrenaline or epinephrine. When the stress experience is longer term, it's then mediated by the hormone cortisol. And we've looked at this. I'm just repeating because repeating and repetition is good for learning. Once the sympathetic nervous system is activated through the neural, that's perceptual, brain, and endocrine mediators, the hypothalamus and so on, once that is activated, it can take 20 minutes or more to downregulate and return to a pre-flight, fight, response baseline. And that adrenaline stays in the system sometimes, like I said, for up to 6 hours. Now, with conscious breath work, it's possible to notice the onset of the sympathetic response, mediate it during arousal with breath work, and then bring it down within 9 breaths. So you can be in control of that to a huge degree, and this is a skill well worth having. We've talked about the kinds of stress, remember? Environmental, things like thermal, hydration, nourishment, altitude, and so on. Developmental, how our systems were set up in our early years. Social, how we respond to social challenges. And perceptual, how we see events and experiences and respond to them. Remember, these 4 are all related and also cross over. One person can sit in an ice bath, unconcerned, and another is feeling threatened and ill. Now, actually, this is not just, about being a better human being because you can sit in an ice bath for a long time. Your mitochondria determine that capacity. Mitochondria are what uses oxygen in the cell to make the cellular energy, the ATP, the adenosine triphosphate. That's where all our energy comes from. And oxygen is used for that purpose. Right? Now, mitochondria, the DNA and the mitochondria are passed on through the mother line. They are matrilineal. And there's a reason for this, which I won't go into now, around the relationship between the DNA of the mitochondria and the DNA in the nucleus of your cells. But they are all passed on through the mother line. So if you have matrilineal mitochondria from a tropical region or a subtropical region, you are much less likely to be able to sit in an ice bath. You will feel stressed by that because your mitochondria aren't producing the same level of heat. They have a different way of uncoupling the mitochondria to produce heat. Because if you cooked up in the tropics, you would die. And that's a matrilineal journey of mitochondrial DNA, and that takes thousands of years to change. Those African people that headed north up into the Arctic and up into the northern climates, people like myself of Viking heritage, the cold doesn't bother us in the same way. We have mitochondrial DNA that enables us to be in the cold. Of course that happens with 40,000 years of journey from Africa to the Arctic realms and living within that. Mitochondria changed. So talking about the cold immersion, for some people, it's really good. Some people can do it for a long time and don't feel threatened by that. Other people do. It's not about everybody should do it. One size does not fit all. Just to say. Now, I also have a gene which means that I don't get angry when I feel hungry. That comes from another aspect of my ancestry. Some people don't. Wherever we go, there is a point where environmental stresses kill our organism. End of story. And it's not a spectrum of supremacy. When we're doing breath work, one thing we're learning is to actively down-regulate our nervous system. Also, to actively up-regulate it and shift through vagal states to be able to go down into dorsal vagal and to go into ventral vagal, amongst other possibilities and eventualities, such as shifting brainwave states from, relaxation state, the alpha brainwave state, into a theta state. Now, we've looked at adrenaline, epinephrine, and cortisol, and how longer-term cortisol release reduces brain function and leads to greater sustained inflammation in the whole system. This is one of the main reasons stress is connected to diseases of inflammation and, by the way, therefore of aging, such as cardiovascular accidents, cancers, and immunological conditions. Inflammation and aging are related. A recap again. In children, toxic levels of cortisol prevent the laying down of myelin, the fatty sheaths along the fast traffic networking parts of the brain that join everything up. This means the fast traffic communication in a cortisol-riddled brain is compromised, and brain centers do not network as well. Now, if this trauma-damaged cortisol-riddled brain its toxic cortisol levels, emotion can be acted out without rational consideration or contextual appreciation. That means we don't have time to think about it, and we don't have time to pay attention to the environment. We just do the feeling. In this situation, learning can be highly compromised. Body and brain growth is also compromised. So whilst cortisol in the short term is a damage limitation exercise, longer term, it is toxic. It harms growth, it harms relationship. The sympathetic nervous system takes us into survival states, remember. Now, so we've got these pieces, dorsal vagal, ventral vagal, and the sympathetic nervous system, which is the opposite of those. So I'm going to talk about hybrid states, which is another really interesting element of the polyvagal theory, these hybrid states. And this is where we have aspects of two of the systems, either dorsal vagal or sympathetic, both engaged at the same time. This is a really helpful way of looking at stress and resilience as well. So let's take a look at these. Now, the dorsal ventral hybrid. This is a cross between the deep relaxation and the drop of dorsal vagal and the social engagement and presence of the ventral vagal. It's most clearly evidenced in really close mammalian contacts, such as cuddles, post-coital embraces, conversations where we're in intimacy. That's where the dorsal ventral vagal comes into its own. The ventral sympathetic hybrid is another one. This is a cross between social engagement and the war zone and the threat of the sympathetic state. Now this is like a war zone, except it's got clear rules. So you know you're not going to be killed, so we can engage there. I'm not going to die, this is all good, it's good fun. And the best example of this is a strong sport, whether that's basketball or football or mountain climbing or what it is. And here there are relatively clear rules. Like I said, whether it's football or martial arts, whatever it is, the consequences of breaking the rules are evidenced, so we can engage in that. And that's the sympathetic ventral hybrid. The sympathetic dorsal hybrid is of concern, and this is where the sympathetic is so powerfully activated for so long that we crash and burn out. And in burnout, we drop into the extreme dorsal vagal function of flop, and at the same time we remain in slightly hypervigilant alertness. We're in hypervigilant alertness, constantly expecting the next attack or crisis, and yet at the same time our body is collapsing into this dorsal vagal, into freeze, flop, fawn, and into fascial dysfunction, and probably into hypercapnia, where carbon dioxide is being eliminated by rapid breathing and oxygen not getting to the brain or the body, so the whole body simply hurts. It's sensitization, it's de-energization, and vigilance combined and taken to extremes, and it is difficult to get out of. Now, with conscious breath work, we can actively move between dorsal vagal, that's, for example, a lengthened exhale. Lengthen your exhale now. Ventral vagal, almost equal length inhale and exhale. We're going to teach you these practices, don't worry about it. With emphasis on a full inhale, sympathetic, we can, a little bit of hyperlength ventilation, we can go into sympathetic, we can go into that. And we can move between the hybrids at will. Unresolved trauma can lead us to live an almost perpetual, hypervigilant, that's highly aroused, high activity lifestyle. This can be anything. It might be, it's about being constantly on the move in some way, mentally or physically or emotionally, literally running around, spending time in the gym. It might be a dysfunctional way of doing that. It might be constantly cleaning. It might be tidying the house or raking up leaves. It's always busy. It might be constantly working, constantly at the desk, constantly going from appointment to appointment or from relationship to relationship. Are these activities done with urgency and a sense of necessity because we wouldn't know who we were otherwise? Or are they done from a place of joy and peaceful presence? Peaceful presence in the task. Some people feel so unsafe in their bodies and in life, they live a kind of shutdown, a perpetual withdrawal. Both kinds of lived trauma, whether hyperactive or hyper shutdown, need to be resolved through safety. A person needs to feel safe first and foremost. Given they feel safe, and how do we know this? How do you know that you feel safe? Shift can happen by moving through the autonomic cycle in any direction that is appropriate. We can move from the dorsal vagal into the ventral vagal. So the breathwork practices enable us to train in doing this. And from here we can go into the flow state. An example of using this might be using one of the breaths I'm going to teach you, an autonomic nervous system balance breath, followed by a short form dynamic practice with breath holds. We can move from dorsal vagal into sympathetic arousal and into the hybrid of sympathetic ventral. That kind of state we're in when we're in a sports state, we're having fun, where we're in there, dynamic engagement. And from here we can dive into the flow state. An example of this might be cold immersion and a more dynamic breathing practice, a little bit like Wim Hof breathing, except done through the nose. We can move from sympathetic arousal into the flow state through a down-regulating breath. Let me change my breath pattern. We're talking about optimal breath work. This we do by lengthening the exhale and coming into a more balanced breath. Maybe, for example, such as a triangle breath, which we're going to teach you. We've talked already a little bit about suboptimal breathing. That's overbreathing. It's when we're breathing faster than our body's oxygen needs demand. Okay, we're breathing more than we need to. And the consequence is carbon dioxide exhaled from the blood. We blow it out from the blood. And that creates an alkalosis, a reduction of hydrogen ion concentration in the blood. And that leads to a more alkaline fluid environment. And we talked about the consequences of that in terms of reduced oxygen uptake in the cells in the brain. Okay? So it's reduced oxygen uptake in the cells and the brain. And it also leads to partial oxygenation of respiratory and cellular metabolites. So this then increases acidity in the blood as a reaction. And then also, on top of that, it compromises the stress response and respiratory rate and depth. Once the hypothalamus is activated again and continually reactivated through any ongoing stress cascade, that's, remember, sustained adrenaline and cortisol release, then the whole body and the whole of the mind is in flight, fight, fright, freeze, fawn, flop state, the Fs. And this will lead to digestive disorders, potential heart conditions, autoimmune disorders, and so on. Now, one of the ways we have available to reduce and resolve these stress cascades and their consequences is the use of conscious breath work. So we're going to give you the practices and the skills you need. You're going to have the range of practices we teach on this course to embed in your life and work with to shift your stress cascade, to radically shift your stress cascade. understanding the balance of blood gases in relation to the stress response, can you begin to understand, can you see the necessity of a systematic, step-by-step, breath-based practice where you can take charge of your state and live optimally? A practice that starts with down-regulation, de-stressing, and a more yin approach to breath holding. Gradually from here, we build up potential and power in the system so as to remain in an internal parasympathetic vagal response and be able to move into a sympathetic response with any breathwork practice and move between states how we choose. So even when the practice appears yang, we can stay relaxed. This is a systematic development of practice. We can also see the necessity of using intelligent breath holding after any practice that increases respiratory rate out of line with metabolic demand, the need for oxygen, because those were blowing out carbon dioxide. And if we learn to hold the breath well, we can build up carbon dioxide levels. So intelligent breath holding is about learning how to be able to use breath work to change state whilst paying attention to blood gases. So we can stay on top of our function, our resources and performance. We can also use the breath as an attentional focus and build the muscles of focus in the brain. And that builds up the power of informed choice. It builds up neurological power between the lateralized and medial aspects of the prefrontal cortex. We can then no longer do the narratives of distress and create experiences of greater ease. Yeah? This kind of practice, which we'll look at more and more through the course of the practices we go through, changes the structure of the brain, literally building in the neurons of focus and choice. Awareness is what is being shared here. Awareness of how we work and awareness of the breath-based practices and how they work. All the breath-based practices are practices of awareness. We cannot change anything if we're not aware of what it is. What shape, texture, form, or pattern our internal responses have. If we're not aware of them, we can't change. And awareness is the ultimate medicine for stress and trauma. Awareness balanced with curiosity, care, and compassion. I'll say it again. Awareness balanced with curiosity, care, and compassion.